Oh, entertainment item for tonight is the presenter tonight is Mr. Ross Sadler, talking about articulated locomotives in Indonesia. What I've read about it on the website, it sounds very, very interesting. Would you please wave a hand to show Ross that you're pleased to see him here? Thank you. Over to Ross.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, for inviting me along tonight. I hope this is going to prove interesting, and I hope also that by the end of tonight you may say that you're still a very dedicated Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes or Festiniog person, and that's fine, but I hope you'll at least appreciate the passion that I have for the engines that inhabited these systems and the systems themselves, the cane tramways of Indonesia. Now, this is a rather typical photo here, taken at Prajakan sugar factory in the very eastern part of Java, and a big 010 getting ready for the road, and that included, of course, putting some sand up front because they sanded their trains manually. Although the engines were indeed fitted with sand domes, the sand domes didn't get used. Okay, well, let's start moving down. And why Java, you might say? Well, I would say, why not? Because I think there really was nowhere else in the world that you could go in 1997 and see a scene like this. An articulated steam locomotive pulling a cane train, beautiful scenery, which included one of Java's active volcanoes, Mount Semeru, going off in the background. Now, I would say I survived this. This does look rather dramatic, but it's actually only Semeru's safety valve. It blows up like this about every 45 to 50 minutes, but it also does have some boiler explosions, which are far less pretty. So, where did it all start for me? Well, it started, really, for me in 1974. An ARHS trip to I don't know where, and ARHS members of long standing would remember that in those days, the Queensland Division, the sales officer was Rod Burgess, an absolute gentleman, and also a great narrow gauge enthusiast. And I went up to where he had his sales on board this ARHS train, and I said, "What have you got for us, Rod?" He said, "Well, I've got something new. This has just come in." And he said, "It's pretty good." He said, "There's some narrow gauge stuff in it too." Well, I looked at this thing and I was just absolutely wowed by the mainline engines and the narrow gauge. And I thought, I've just got to go and have a look at this. Well, at that stage I was a grad student at Queensland University, and the university saw us grad students as cheap labour in terms of running prac classes. So they'd only let us take our holidays in the December-January period. It certainly wasn't a good time to see any cane trains running, but at least I'd be able to see the main line, and that made me very, very happy. So I set off, armed with nothing more than the knowledge from this and also this publication by Dusty Durrant, and knowing that both these publications made reference to the fact that the sugar factories operated an extensive network of narrow-gauge steam locomotives. So I took a flight to Bali, a Garuda flight. I got there, and I was a tourist for a while. I went to the beach. Well, that wasn't hard because the hotel I stayed in was right on the beach. I went and had a look at some of the temples, did the cultural thing, went to some dance performances, and after a few days in Bali, thoroughly enjoyed it, I decided to head off. And I headed off by plane from Bali to Java, to Surabaya. Surabaya is the second city in Indonesia, major commercial hub, and I might say in steam days the suppliers like Orenstein and Koppel and De Croo and Brawns actually had offices in Surabaya to feed the very, very lucrative trade that there's going on with them at the moment. So later on I wouldn't take this sort of route at all. I would simply get a ferry across from Gilimanuk in Bali to Ketapang in Java, get on a bus, and by the afternoon I was up here photographing narrow gauge trains hauling sugarcane. Now, the nice thing I would say about flying, though, was that if you had an obliging captain, he would take you over the fumaroles of some of East Java's active volcanoes. You could get a shot like this. I would say that later I came to have a totally different appreciation of these volcanoes because it was quite common practice for the sugar mills to name their steam locomotives after active volcanoes, so there were a lot of Bromos and Semerus running around. Okay, so I got to Surabaya, and in Surabaya, that was the next day. I went and I had a quick look at the steam tram depot. I didn't have time to do the steam trams that visit. I did them another visit, but that was the depot. And then I decided to get off on a morning train to Central Java. This is the leaving of Surabaya, you might say, and there we went. The train was hauled by one of the BB30 class diesel hydraulic locomotives, which Frank showed us last time. But great excitement. A few stations out of Surabaya, we crossed this train headed by one of the big D52 Krupp 282s, pulling a train of petrol bombs. And in the train also was this little C21 class 060. It had been up to Madiun Works for an overhaul and was on its way home. What happened from there? Kertosono, 90 kilometres out of Surabaya, and this is what it looked like. And I'd tell you that Kertosono had a roundhouse, so what you see in this shed was just the overflow. Imagine what this did to a boy from the south side of Brisbane who'd seen nothing much more than PB15s and D17s. Anyway, we were held up there for quite a while, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but I was able to do some photography of what was going on. This is a C28 class 464 tank, and they were greatly prized by the crews. In the colonial days, they used to run passenger trains at better than 70 miles an hour. This was one of the few wood burners that was left around. They were mostly oil burners by that stage. Well, when it got a train out of the way, we got to look at another D52. This one was D52014. And the next thing that emerged was the thing Frank told us about last time, the F10 class 212-2. And as Frank rightly said, you just couldn't believe your eyes. The wheels kept coming and coming. Well, all the while there were some rather important gentlemen having discussions about our train. Now, I didn't know what was going on. Finally, I worked out the D52 came off this local passenger train that it was on, and it moved up, took the diesel off our train, which had obviously failed, and that what they'd worked out was that the D52 would take the train up a few stations, then cross with another train, and we would get the diesel from that, and the D52 would go back to Kertosono. So this is not bad for the first day. Have a ride behind steam. Well, we got up to Yogyakarta, as it was known then. Now it's known as Yogya. Yogya was D52 country, and you could see these wonderful scenes going on at the loco shed, boiler washouts, etc., etc. You'll notice the crews here very, very big on steel toe-capped safety boots. There were also some other very interesting sights around Yogya. Bang! And you could also see D52s working a whole lot of trains out of Yogya. Now, while I was in the Yogya area, I did a bit of touristy stuff and went and had a look at some of the wonderful temples. This is the 8th to 9th century Borobudur temple. Wonderful place. But I'm afraid I'm a bit of a Philistine, and I saw something to me was much more of a temple, and that was this Gondang Baru sugar factory. It didn't look quite like this because it was not running at the stage. This yard was all full of cane trucks, empty cane trucks. It wouldn't be running for quite a few months. You might be rather interested by this feature here at the front, which generally we don't see in Australian sugar mills. The Indonesians really like to get their lime fresh for liming the cane juice to drop out the proteins. And so they do their own roasting of limestone, and many mills have this sort of facility that Gondang Baru did. Well, all the way up on this trip from Surabaya, I had seen these wonderful interchanges, you might say, with the narrow gauge systems of the sugar mills. There were certainly grade crossings, there were flyovers, there were underpasses, you name it, the whole lot. And I thought, boy, I've got to come back and see this. I started having dreams of what it might look like in real life, and with the aid of one of these modern video programs, I've been able to create a dreamlike sequence so you get some sort of an idea. And here you see a scene. This is taken at a place called Chomal, and here's the 3-foot 6 gauge train, the PJKA train, coming along. And waiting for it to pass are two 600mm gauge trains from the nearby sugar factory at Saragi. So eventually they gain the road. You can see it's quite a nasty dip there at the crossing, and they make their way. Well, with that dream, I was convinced I was going to come back one day. It took me 4 years to get back there because I was overseas quite a bit in the interim. But I did get back there, and this is the sugar growing areas of Java. Now, obviously, if you'd looked in the heyday of the industry, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, you'd have found a lot more. You also, if you looked at this situation today, you would notice some of these areas have disappeared. That is certainly the way the industry has gone in Java, because they've started building a lot of bigger factories in Sumatra and growing cane there. Okay, so moving right along, how do we say sugar mill? Well, in Dutch it's Suikerfabriek, and even in the years long after independence, some of the engines, like this one at Wonolangan Sugar Factory, which is an 080 by the way, still carried these brass plates that had been there in the Dutch days. The Indonesian term is pabrik gula, often shortened to PG. The Indonesians didn't go for brass plates so much, they just painted the name on the side, Kanagoro Sugar Factory, the east part of Java. Now, certainly the Dutch had a lot to do with the development of the sugar industry, but they weren't the first. Actually, the century before the Dutch got into it, in the 18th century, the Chinese were the millers, and they had about 170 mills. Now, they weren't high-tech modern mills with cane diffusers and that sort of thing. Rather, they would be this sort of thing here that probably produced nothing more than Demerara sugar. Well, the Dutch came along, they decided to get in the act with sugar, and in so doing, they decided that they would have to do some research if they were going to get the best out of this industry. So they had 3 research stations. The first one at Pasuruan in East Java, that was agricultural research. The second one at Semarang in Central Java, that was mill technology. And the third one at Cirebon in the western part of Java, that was the plant pathology research station. And I think we do have some ladies in the audience tonight, so you'll probably be gratified to know, ladies, that even in 1929 the entire staff of this Cirebon station was female. So they had their bit of gender equity. Subsequently, the other 2 stations have gone, and the Pasuruan station is where all the activity is centralised today. I had the good fortune of going there some years later to talk to them about some of the work we'd been doing on sugar mill wastes in Australia. I don't think they wanted to know very much about wastewaters, but they were very gracious hosts. Moving along, what did all this research give? Well, firstly, the mill technology, a chap called Honig, made some great advances in vacuum pan design. But more significantly even was the work done by the plant breeders. Now, as you probably know, sugarcane is like roses. It has to be propagated generally asexually. But if you want to come up with a really whiz-bang new strain, the only way is to do the hard yards, to cross-pollinate it, to grow the seedlings up, knowing that 99.9% of these will be utter rubbish, and there will be, perhaps if you're very lucky, one winner. Well, a chap called Saltvedel did manage to get the process going pretty well. He did the cross-pollination, and he and his co-workers came up with this strain POJ2878. The POJ, by the way, stands for Proof Station Oost Java, the East Java Experiment Station. And this was a wonder cane. It was a cane for, by, and of Indonesia. They tried it for a while up at Mossman, and it was okay, but it didn't give anything like the phenomenal yields it did in Java. Well, what happened to the industry? Well, at the very, very end of the 1920s, things were very rosy. It was the second largest sugar producer in the world. But there were a lot of problems, because despite all this good scientific, technological, and agricultural research, the economics underpinning the industry were pretty iffy. And so what happened was that their markets, for one reason or other, started to dry up. Now, they did certainly have some markets in Europe where it had to compete with the locally produced beet sugar. But they had big markets in Asia. One of them was Japan, and as you might know, Japan had a major earthquake in the 1920s, and of course that wiped out a lot of that market. India was another market. You might say, hey, there's something strange here, because I've seen all these photos of ex-World War I light rail locomotives that work at Indian sugar factories. Well, that's very true, but the British didn't, until the 1920s, really worry too much about developing a sugar industry in India. After that they did, and of course that wiped out that market. And there was a phenomenal crash. The industry came to its senses. The Dutch had at first started to just simply stockpile sugar, but that didn't work. So they went from having about 180 odd sugar factories in 1930. In a couple of years' time, they only had about 33 open. And the Depression did very little for that. The Dutch finally got their act together, and after that the industry picked up. But then there was World War II, and a lot of the sugar mill machinery that was there was cut up by the Japanese and used as scrap iron to make munitions. And so the war had its toll. A lot of pests and diseases were rife just after the war, and it's only just very recently that they've started building these factories in Sumatra, and they're getting up to near the production they had in the late 1920s. And the trouble is, of course, that at that stage, the Indonesian population was relatively small. It's now very large. Indonesians love sweet things. And as a result, Indonesia is still to this day a major sugar importer. So let's get on to the transport situation. If you'd gone there in the Chinese days, you'd have seen this sort of scene. And you could see it still in the 1980s. Sugarcane being brought to the mill by bullock cart or water buffalo cart. Now, probably the Chinese would not have had pneumatic tyres as this did, but apart from that, the scene is timeless. In Indonesia, sugar cane is cut manually. It's placed onto narrow gauge cane trucks and it's piled onto them longitudinally, in other words, parallel to the track, not transversely to the track as we did. And then, of course, it has to be got off the portable track to the main line, and at Padipaten factory, one of the most westerly factories around, even in the 1980s you could see scenes like this where coolie labour was used to move the cane up off the portable track. More commonly, they used bullocks for this sort of thing. And I might just digress here for a minute because the current issue of the English Narrow Gauge magazine is all to do with non-locomotive worked lines. And it's fair to say that even in the 80s and 90s there was a factory at Sragen which simply used bullock teams not just to snig the cane off the portable track but to pull it all the way to the mill. That was the exception. Most of them did use bullock teams on the portable track and sometimes even a light locomotive as well. Some of the more advanced mills, and this one is Pagatan factory in just the eastern part of Java, they used tractors to pull the cane up off the portable track. Okay, so to the locomotives. Who was the first person to use locomotive traction for pulling cane in Indonesia? I don't know. We do know that Orenstein and Koppel, who seemed to be the preferred provider of motive power for the tramways, they did supply an engine to Java in 1894. And presumably this went to a sugar mill, you can't be sure. It was a small 040 like this. This engine came along about 6 years later. With an 042, of course, and there were 042s around, the trailing axle was something the Dutch didn't like because it actually represented a loss of weight for adhesion. And here's an 042, this one also working at the same factory as that other one, Pakas Baru factory, 750mm gauge factory in central Java. There were some larger 042s built, but of course when you start thinking about axle loads, and imagine an 18-ton loco just to make the figures easy, if you've got an 040 you're talking about a 9-ton axle load, which is getting up towards mainline standards. But it's also true that the very last steam locomotive that was ever built for Indonesia was this one, built by Hunslet in 1971. And this engine was operating at Trangil Sugar Factory. The KA there is simply the company that owned it, and it's the same company that owned another sugar mill in East Java, Kebon Agung. That's what that's all about. But it was an 042. Of course, it was built to the design of a Kerr Stewart Brazil class locomotive, because when Kerr Stewart went to the wall, Hunslet had taken over their patterns and made some of their locomotives, so that was why this one was there. Okay, well, I've been talking for quite a long time now, and I think you deserve a bit of a rest and a bit of entertainment. So, for anyone who still thinks that a 4-coupled loco is the way to go for a cane tramway, I've got this clip here taken in 2001 at Trangil Sugar Factory. This is where the Hunslet operated, but this is not the Hunslet. And perhaps by the end of this video you'll see maybe 4 couples not the best way to go. Two things I'd say about it. Obviously, to be a loco driver at an Indonesian sugar factory, you have to have an awful lot of persistence. And the other thing that may surprise you is that an engine that burns bagasse can turn out such a black smoke. Well, bagasse has got very low calorific value. The crews know this all too well. They also know that they can get plenty of waste sump oil from local garages, which they do, and so they slice the bagasse up before they throw it into the firebox, and they then dip it in a drum of oil, and that's why you get the black smoke. Well, now all this led to the Dutch plantation tramway philosophy. They wanted bigger locomotives with more wheels, and that would keep the axle load down and also aid adhesion. But they also wanted 100% of the weight to be available for adhesion. And when we start thinking of other types, well, let's put another lot of driving wheels on. You get an 060T, popular solution for smaller engines with 100% of the weight, of course, available for adhesion. Now, some bigger examples were built as well, but the axle load is only the total weight divided by 3, and using our figure of 18 again, we've got our axle load down to 6 tons. Various engines around. This one worked at Panji Sugar Factory in East Java, and there were also bigger ones built. This one built by Vulcan Iron Works from Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania. Wilkes-Barre, by the way, is one of the depressed steel towns that Donald Trump said he's going to breathe new life into, so if Donald doesn't go to jail for the next millennium, we might see a lot more of these engines running around. These were built largely during World War I when they couldn't get stuff from Orenstein and Koppel. This one worked at Banjaratma factory in the western part of Java. 062Ts were not very often used. They're very common in Queensland, not so much here. The Dutch didn't like this idea of a trailing axle that was a loss of weight, available for adhesion. And there we see one of the places that did operate these things, which was Panka Sugar Factory. They did operate these engines built by Jung, which were 062s. In the end, though, some of these were transferred to a neighbouring factory, Sragi. There's a picture of one of them. I think that picture is actually at Sragi and not at Panka. Now the question arises, could we build a four-coupled loco? Well, certainly we could, but we have a problem in working out how the thing's going to get around sharp curves. Now we come to various solutions, and the simplest solution would be to keep the driving wheels small and place them close together. Well, that's all very well in its way, but there are inherent problems as regards the riding characteristics and lateral forces on the train at speed. Now here's an example of an engine of that kind. Nevertheless, they did build some to this sort of thing, and this particular engine worked at Colomadu factory near Solo in central Java. You'll see, of course, that it does have quite a substantial tender there, and that would, to quite a significant extent, overcome the idea that a train could suffer lateral forces from an engine, because, of course, this would damp out that quite easily. Now, another simple solution would be this one, and this was worked out by this chap, Karl Gersdorf. He was a mechanical engineer with the Austrian State Railways, and he said you could provide two of the axles with additional side play and add some corresponding freedom to the relevant rods. And these, of course, were called Gersdorf axles. Here's an engineering diagram of such an engine, an 080, and of course there's always going to be a debate about which wheels you decide to put the Gersdorf axles on. In this particular case, they've been put on axles 2 and 4. Other people might say they should be on 1 and 4. And now we have a picture of an engine with Gersdorf axles. This was built by Henschel and worked at Kebon Agung Sugar Factory in the eastern part of Java. And we actually have a video clip of one of these engines in action. Actually a sister engine at Kebon Agung Factory. Another solution, and a better one, came from Orenstein and Koppel. There they are, Benno Orenstein and Arthur Koppel. And they said, let's hire this whiz kid called Lutermohler as our CME. And they did just that. And his first expedient was to employ a special type of axle that had been developed by two other German engineers, Ewald Klein and Heinrich Lindner. They worked in the Royal Saxon State Railways. And the only requirement was that the engine needed to have outside frames like this one has. So what's it all about? Well, you have a normal driving axle. I've just stylized this as a normal driving axle from an outside framed locomotive. You have your cranks, you have your wheels, of course. What did they do? They dropped the wheels off the axles. Now that sounds pretty crazy, but that's what they did. They then remounted these wheels onto a hollow false axle, and it was fitted with a central pivot. And then they put the whole thing back together again, so that this thing could flop around as much as it liked without affecting the cranks, and particularly the side rods, which are always going to be your limitation in terms of getting a rod locomotive round a sharp curve. Now here's an engineering diagram simply showing that sort of thing. And here we have a cane toad's eye view of one of these engines. You can see it does have Klein-Lindner axles at the front and at the back, axles 1 and 4, and these things are held in place by these tie rods. These tie rods are there to pull the thing back into the right place after it comes out of the curve. Who built these engines? Well, Orenstein and Koppel for one, and I've tried to put builders' plates up here. This one, by the way, comes from 1900, so you can see old Lutermohler got in the act fairly early, and it worked at Mojopanggung sugar factory in East Java. Maffei, they certainly did them too, and this engine worked at Kalebagor factory. De Kroon-Brons, yes, they built them. De Kroon-Brons, the Dutch builder, very characteristically on many of their locos, this triangular builder's plate, which English people might say was a Naismith Wilson plate upside down, and I guess it is too. This one at Sumbahajo factory. Hanomag, yes, they built these Klein-Lindner engines as well, as did indeed Jung. And Henschel didn't build a lot of them, but this is another one at Cholomadu factory. And we have a clip coming up here of one of these engines in action. This one is at Sindanglaut factory, and it was built by De Kroon-Brons. And the interesting thing is, I've just told you that De Kroon-Brons always had a triangular builder's plate. Well, latterly they did. They're very early engines, and this was engine number 24. They just had a rectangular plate. Now, just to digress a little bit from the cane tramways for just a moment, the PJKA also had clean Lindner locomotives. Example was this D15 class. They actually started off in a steam tram operation down at Semarang, but in my time they were based out of Tegal, which is in the western part of Java. So this wasn't the end of the clean Lindner story, getting back to the cane locomotives. Both Borsig and Ornstein and Koppel started to rethink this tie rod business. Now, as you remember, the situation was like this. There was this massive tie rod here, and they began to ask themselves, why are we doing this when we have a perfectly stable axle right behind the clean Lindner axle? Why could we not simply put a sleeve on that particular stable axle there and attach the clean Lindner axle to that? And that's exactly what was done. Now here's an engineering diagram simply showing that sort of thing. And the convenient thing about all this too was if you wanted to work on the thing, all you had to do was to remove the keeper plates from the horn blocks and the whole thing dropped out just like this and you could service it. This particular picture was taken at Jatiwangi factory in West Java, where just that sort of thing has been done. And you can clearly see the thing simply attached to the axle behind. Well, this was picked up by a number of places. Borsig, of course, were one of the instigators. This engine worked at Sendang Laut factory, where we've just seen that video. But also Ornstein and Koppel got in on the act, and this is a picture at Banjaratma factory, also in the western part of Java. But Herr Littemoller was thinking further. If you're wondering, that's what he looked like. He never missed one of those midwinter swims down in Hobart. And what he thought was that even more flexibility could be squeezed out of this arrangement. Axles 2 and 3 could be moved apart to the maximum acceptable distance for an 040, and axles 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 could then come together quite closely, creating a virtual bogie. So to look at the thing in terms of a diagram, here we are. First, he moves the outer axles right out. Then the inner axles move to the maximum acceptable distance for an 040, and you see you have the two virtual bogies. And the clean Lindner axle's tie rod is simply a small thing like this that's attached to a cross member on the frame. Now you may see a parallel here to the work of Charles Heisler in the USA, because of course Heisler did exactly the same sort of thing. The only difference was that for axles 2 and 3, the drive was not by rods, but by gears. Now here's an engineering diagram simply showing that sort of thing. And it's very easy to distinguish an engine of this particular arrangement because you'll notice the quite wide separation between axles 2 and 3 and the relatively close arrangement of axles 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Other manufacturers like Ducru and Bronze got in on the act. They weren't quite so adventurous with their spacing of the two inner axles, but nevertheless the same principle. And another manufacturer who got involved was Linke Hofmann. Now, Linke Hofmann were based in Breslau. If you go looking at an atlas today, you won't find Breslau anywhere. The simple reason it's now the Polish city of Wrocław. The borders were moved after World War II. And we have a clip of one of these engines operating, this one at Ringenanom factory in East Java. And I think you'll see why I chose that particular video. Okay, well, I think we've done about as much as we can with clean Lindner axles. Let's move on to something else. Malays. And of course, Malays were big things in Indonesia on the 3-foot 6 gauge main line. And if you went up to Garut or Cibatu, you could see scenes like this very easily. The plantation Malays were somewhat more compact and smaller. They generally had outside frames on the rear engine unit unless it was a very small locomotive, and they had inside frames on the front engine unit. This sort of arrangement, of course, allowed them to have a decent-sized firebox at the end, and that was why they went for outside frames there. Who built these engines? Well, De Croo and Bronze, and they were probably the most successful builder of the lot. This particular engine operated at Nadirejo factory, and there were others as well. Orenstein and Koppel, of course, here's an Orenstein and Koppel engine. This one at Rejo Agung factory in Madiun in just the beginning of East Java. And you'll notice that there's, of course, the characteristic Hackworth valve gear that Orenstein and Koppel liked to put on locomotives. And Borsig also built engines of this kind, this one at Kalibagor factory. Jung were builders as well, and this engine is at Jatibarang factory in the western part of Java. A sister engine, this one another young Malay, went to England for preservation and then was on-sold to a tourist operation in the West Indies. There used to be a calypso song around, if you want to see some good cricket, man, go to the West Indies. Well, perhaps we should change that to, if you want to see some good Malays, man, go to the West Indies. And I have a clip of a Malay operating here at Kalibagor factory. This is the Borsig we saw in the slide just a little while ago. Now, the interesting thing about this, you'll notice, is that the engine is running bunker first, and that was fairly common with mills. Not all mills did this, but the thinking was that the front engine unit is quite floppy, and with a heavy train in tow, it tends to be lifted up and it's prone to derail. So they generally found it more convenient to have the heavier engine unit, that's the bunker end, going first when they were coming from the fields with a loaded train, and work stack first, of course, when they just had a train of empties. Okay, well, leaving the Malays, let's revisit these Gilsdorf axles. And we saw an engine there, an 080 with Gilsdorf axles at Kebon Agung factory. But why stop at 4 axles? If you went for 5 axles, and again our 18-ton engine that we were talking about, well, you would find that you were about 3.5 tons axle loading, which is starting to sound very attractive for a light railway. And this is a picture of such an engine built by De Croo and Bronze. Here's the actual engine itself. It's one of the 2 Super Gilsdorfs built by De Croo and Bronze for Strykerfabrik Sendang Petol. Now, the reason I've only got a picture out of a book is that's all that anyone saw in recent times. There seems to be no record of these engines after World War II. They were certainly quite modern affairs with a feed water heater there and everything, and they probably got cut up by the Japanese. It may have ended up a Japanese mini-submarine. Now, even with these super Gurlsdorfs, though, you started to run into troubles with the rods. On straight track, things were okay. But when you hit a curve, these outer rods here started to twang out, as you can see. So if you do a little bit of calculation, you can go through some Pythagoras stuff and find that for an engine with 150mm side play and the wheels spaced at 760mm, and that's exactly what they were in that slide we just saw of the diagram of the engine, then on a curve at maximum travel, the coupling rod is 14.7mm too short. Now that doesn't mean that it's going to break, but it does mean that you're going to start wearing your brasses. It does mean that you are actually going to be detracting from the pulling power of the engine because there are frictional losses there. Is there a solution? Well, yes, there is. And it's a strange solution when you first hear it. Add a sixth stabilizing axle. You're probably saying, what? Well, this is a special axle. It has no wheels, it is rigid, and it is wider than the wheels or cranks, depending on whether the engine's got inside and outside frames. And you see, the beauty of this thing is that unlike the clean Lindner arrangement, you're not locked into having outside frames. You can have inside frames as well if you like. How does all this work? Well, it's shown in this slide. You see, the engine, here is our engine with the standard arrangement going around the curve, 010, and you see those rods twinging out, etc., etc. But now, look at this here. You notice the yellow stabilizing axle. This is the stabilizing axle there. It's wider than the others. It holds the rod out. And in an idealized diagram, this is what happens when it's on a curve. There would be a bit of movement of rods, admittedly, but not nearly as much as there would be in the one above. What is the industry policy about all this? Well, firstly, Mr. Von Hoff, who was the CME at De Croo and Bronze, said it was okay, cane trains moved too slowly to need one, and he didn't bother to put one on these Sendang Pitot locos. Now, Schwarzkopf in Berlin, who by that stage had become Berliner Maschinenbau, said that's not true at all cane locos need one. And in the end, even Mr. Von Hoff capitulated. He did put one on a loco that he built for the Nepal Railway, and you can just see the stabilizing axle there. I'd have to say, in all honesty, that I did travel on the old Nepal Railway, and this is the 2'6" one, not the modern broad gauge one, and it didn't move much faster than a cane train. Anyway, just moving on, here's a picture of one of these ones at Chepa Baru. It has inside frames, and if you look right at the end here, you see the stabilizing axle. And when I was at Chepa Baru, I actually got the crews to line up the two engines they had of this kind. There they are, just so I could get a picture of the two of them. Unfortunately, Mr. Kodak managed to crimp the edge of this here, and I'll have to do something about that one day with his cardboard mount. So we go now to a clip of one of these engines operating. This is at Olian factory in East Java, and right at the end you can see the stabilizing axle. Now, you don't need to have inside frames. You can have an outside framed one if you like. Here's an outside framed engine that operated at Sragi factory. Again, the stabilizing axle. And here we have a video clip of one of those engines in action. You'll notice they have the same considerate bike riders there as we do in Australia. Okay, now our friend Herr Luttermoller was still thinking though, and he said, let's go for broke, build an 010, and if the rods are a problem, well, let us only connect the central axles by rods, in other words, axles 2, 3 and 4, and we would connect the outer axles to those by a flexible gear drive. Now, the gear train obviously has to have 3 gear wheels, so the driving wheels go in the same direction. Here's an engineering diagram of one of those engines, and you can clearly see the 3 central axles there, the ball and socket joint, which is part of the gear train and fits on the axles 2 and 4. And this is just a view of what the gear train looks like. And this one simply shows you that you have to have 3 gears in the train so that the 2 wheels go in the same direction. Well, again, you could build inside or outside framed versions. Here's an inside framed version that worked at Pagatan factory. And here we have a clip of one of these engines working another engine in the Madiun area, this one at Rejosari factory. You could also have outside framed versions of this. This one worked at Kebon factory near Malang in East Java. And they built some really big versions. And this monster worked at Tasak Madu factory, very close to Solo in central Java. And other builders who got in on the act, the other one who did was Henschel and Company. All right, well, we're getting to the end of the articulations, etc. And it's worth mentioning the Engert type engines that were built. Now, there was this gentleman called Engert. he said, look, this is a terrible waste. We've got a tender here, which is just a vehicle, and it's got considerable weight, and yet none of this weight's transferred to the driving wheels. So what he did was to actually transfer the weight of these with a flexible coupling. He transferred some of the weight of the tender to the driving wheels. He also put a steam engine in here so these tender wheels were driven. Now, unfortunately, at the time he did this, it was a good enough idea, but the gears, and he had a gear train involved in driving these wheels at the back on the tender, the gears were not of very good quality, and so the thing failed. So people subsequently gave up on the idea of gears, but they still liked the idea of having this transfer of some of the weight to the driving wheels. And these engines were loosely called Angert engines, even though Angert himself really wanted those tender wheels to be driven. This engine worked in the Madiun area, also at Sorono factory, and you can see, I think, the sharing of the tender weight there. Okay, now Berliner Maschinenbau went even further, and they built a chain-driven articulated locomotive with 2 bogies. And here we have a happy holiday snap of Mr. Bullied in Munich. That is a genuine picture of Mr. Bullied, by the way, and he's saying, not as good as mine, but you have to hand it to these Germans. Engines of this kind were built for various places. Chukir factory in East Java, they were the ones who, in latter times anyway, still had engines of this kind. And this is an old photo taken by Frank Jones. So how's all this work? Well, we have our cane toad again with this cane toad's eye view. And the key to it all is this lay shaft. Now, as you'll see, the drive to the axles goes on alternate sides there. Just exactly the same as was done with the leader, except, of course, the leader didn't have a lay shaft. It had another set of driving wheels in the middle. The effect was the same. Now, you look over here, you can see the piston rod and the valve rod. Now, that in itself says something, because if the cane toad can see these two things, it tells you straight away that the cylinders and valve chests have to be offset. And this has probably been done to keep the bogies compact. Obviously, with a normal engine, if the cane toad looked at it, all he would see would be the piston rod, because the valve rod would be directly above that, and the piston rod would obscure it. Now, these engines had a form of Marshall valve gear. That's Marshall valve gear. But true Marshall valve gear, of course, is worked out for something where the cylinders are directly below the valve chest. Well, we've already said that's not the case here, which is why we have to have this thing on the outside coming from that lay shaft, an eccentric rod, a vibrating arm, and a rocker arm that actually drove the valves, and those valves, of course, are inside the frame. This motion, though, is outside. Okay, by the time I got to Java, this was all that was left. Pretty sad state. But it's not the end, because on my model railway, I have one of these engines, and it runs very nicely, so it's still running into the 21st century. Further information on all these things, let me just go through what's around on the web, which is the place I think everyone goes for information these days. Firstly, Rob Dickinson's wonderful International Steam Sweet Dreams pages. Now, he's gone through every mill that used steam engines here, and he's got photos, static photos, of just about every engine he could. It's worth visiting this, by the way, because this process is autocatalytic, and when people see that Rob's doing something with the material that they've given him or that someone else has given him, they give him extra stuff and he puts that up. So things do appear here from time to time. It's certainly very much a live site. Secondly, Rob's International Steam YouTube channel. Now, all of the clips I've shown you tonight either are there or will be there. So keep watching. Rob's got a whole lot of videos of his own there. My videos are there. And also, if you're interested in the stationary steam machinery, reciprocating engines, steam-driven vacuum pumps, etc., at sugar mills in Java, you'll find good coverage of them there. So a very exciting site. We also have my site where I put pictures of diesels and things that obviously don't go very well on an international steam site. We have the diesels there, and you can visit that channel. That tells you a bit about it too. Okay, so we're going to get near the end with the penultimate thing of saying, well, let's have a look at some engines again in operation. This is at Gondang Baru factory in 1983, and we have two engines here, the first one an Orenstein and Koppel, and the other one a Linke Hoffmann, both clean Lindner. Well, everyone's probably saying, yeah, great stuff, but all 19th century got nothing really to do with the 21st century. Well, I say that it has. 3 years ago, we had COVID, as you know, and that gave rise really to these Zoom meetings as we see them today. But it also gave rise to lockdowns. Children were kept at home. They couldn't go to school, see their mates, and people were saying you should do something for the children, like have a teddy bear hunt in your area. People in our street got on the act and they did exactly that. And some of them, because we're in a bushland setting, put their teddy bears up in a tree. I did something a bit different. I built a wooden mock-up of one of the Schwarzkopf chain-driven articulated locos and put my teddy bear in that. And the kids loved it. So yes, it's all got an application in the 21st century.
Well, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Yes, that was very good, Ross. Thank you very much for that. It's now question time. Is there? I'm sure there's plenty of people who've got questions for you, Ross. Go on, don't be shy.
Well, I might tell you, I did do a presentation for Angram's many years ago. This will just break the ice for people. And there was this Austrian gentleman came along who was very attentive and looked through it all. And when it came question time, he was the first to put his hand up. And I thought, oh, he's going to say, are there any Floridsdorf engines there? And I was going to have to say, no, I'm sorry, there aren't. But no, that wasn't what he said. He said, how much does a woman cost there? So, so no one should be shy after that.
Can I come in? Scott Clement here. I'm a bit intrigued to the fuel that was being used. Was that just spent cane or what?
Yes, the gas was the fuel. There's an interesting story in this one. When I first went there, a lot of the mills were burning oil because Indonesia, as you know, is a big OPEC country and oil was pretty cheap and nasty. Some always used the gas, but as the years went on, more and more of them got over into using the gas. And I say, of course, that advisedly because it was the gas subsidy with a bit of stump oil added to it. But yeah, many and more of them got into using the gas as the years went on. Some of the mills used wood. Banjaratna was a user of wood. Kebanagon, except for one season, I saw it's the only season they tried to use the gas, they used wood. And others, such as Damas, they stuck to the oil right to the bitter end. It all, of course, depends on the mill, the quality of the gas they produce, whether it's dry enough, and et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. You're probably aware of the fact that Mr. Porta, the famous Argentinian loco engineer, was at the time of his death doing some work in Cuba, trying to work out efficient ways to use the gas as a fuel. And certainly the way it's used in Indonesia was not the most efficient, but yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give you.
Nigel here. Thank you very much, Ross. It was very fascinating, and I learned so much about those different configuration engineering solutions they came up with regarding the wheels, as well as got a couple of questions. Was there any coal? Is there any coal mines in Java? Did they use coal anywhere? Or was that only mainly for the?
Let me tell you, the coal in Indonesia was actually at a place called Sawalunto in Sumatra. And thereby hangs another very interesting railway tale, which is perhaps worth mentioning at least. This line from Sawalunto went down to a place called Padang on the west coast. And it was a rack line, and they had a variety of rack locos there, even some recently built ones by Nippon Shiro. They had them. But during the Second World War, the Japanese were very keen to get their hands on this coal, and they built with prisoner labor another death railway, rather like the bridge over the River Kwai story. This one went down to the east coast because the west coast was never very secure for the Japanese. So they got this thing built, and there's a very good website which you can find. There are books written about this too. Now, your question pertains to the actual engines. The mills, not a great deal. I believe at one stage Kanagoro mill did try to use, or they were probably forced into a bit of a corner. The gas was just not up to scratch, and they got some Sumatran coal. This Sumatran coal is also brought to Java for coal-fired power stations. They built a huge one at a place called Paiton, and it's a huge coal-fired power station and not a very nice thing. Pollutes the atmosphere and used to ruin all the sunset shots of the nearby sugar mills once it got going. But no, they didn't use coal to a great extent, but there was a little bit of usage on the cane tramways. Basically, I mean, these were shoestring operations. So hopefully that's answered your question.
Ross, it's Mike. I'll just ask you to stop the sharing just for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. We'll get more faces on the screen. Yeah, we'll get more faces on the screen. Yeah,
we don't need that anymore, Mike. That's fine. I've just stopped the right thing.
That's better. Thank you.
That's good. Okay, we're here.
Any more questions?
Yes. You mentioned, is it a metric 600 millimeter coming from the European system as versus what we know 610 2-foot gauges we have mainly in Australia and other predominant 2-foot gauges around the world?
Nigel, I have to say to you that we're incredibly fortunate in Queensland, with one exception, that all our mills are laid to the same gauge. It was not the situation in Indonesia by any manner of means. Probably 700 millimeters was the most common gauge. There were certainly 600 millimeter systems. There was even one 900 millimeter, and there were a couple of odd ones, a 670 and a 720. And if you go quickly searching for a converter, an online converter, you'll find they make just as much nonsense in imperial as they do in metric. The thing I find fascinating was that they started laying the mainline railways just before the Queensland Railways got started. They started laying the 4-foot 8.5, and there was that link between Yogya and Solo, which was 4-foot 8.5 for many years until the Japanese came and straightened it up. But surprisingly, a couple of years after Queensland, they decided to go for 3-foot 6. Now, you know, metric people going for 3-foot 6, I'm sure there must be a story to be told. Someone must have come and had a look in Queensland, because it was quite a radical thing for Queensland to do in those days. And John Knowles has written extremely well on this and at length. Anyone going to, what shall I say, going to 3-foot 6, because there had been a few lines elsewhere in the world, but you know, the QR was really the first big thing, and it was a big plunge for anyone to take. So
could I make a comment there? 3-foot 6 certainly was adopted in South Africa because of cost.
Oh, and it makes us laugh when people talk about it as Cape gauge, because the South African railways appeared long after the Queensland 3-foot 6 gauge.
But what I'm trying to say is it could be a cost implication.
Oh, it was a cost implication in Queensland. There's no doubt about it. And you can imagine, you know, one thing that hasn't changed in all the years is politicians. And you could imagine, you know, taking a punt like that at anything at that stage or at any stage, you know, and what you'd face from the opposition. So, I mean, yes, but it was one case where the minister proved to win over Sir Humphrey and not the other way around.
Could I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
It was fashionable to adopt 3-foot 6-inch gauge around about 1869.
Yes, but QR was 1865. And
No, not
so
in Indonesia.
not in
No. The 3'6" was pioneered in Norway in 1861, and Queensland followed Norway, and then Norway and Queensland showed that it could work. And around about 1869, 1870, places like Canada, Japan, Indonesia, Java, and a few others all adopted it at once.
Well, Java was actually a little bit ahead of that, but yes, you're very right. It's I mean, the QR really was the thing that that probably showed it, and it is the oldest surviving 3'6" gauge system anywhere in the world. But yeah, I'm sure the ghost of Dusty Darrant would be telling us that what he said, that the whole of Australia should have been laid to 3'6". Now I won't get into that, but yeah.
The converse for that one was that British colonial India and British colonial Malaysia went for meter gauge for the secondary.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But anyway, it all worked. I think that's the end thing, that it all worked.
Not to mention East Africa.
Oh yeah, East African, yes, another one.
Just wondering whether there's still any steam operated cane railways in Indonesia.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. There sort of are now. Redrasari Mill, which is one of the ones we looked at there and saw stuff from, they have actually got back into the business of using steam for shunting. They have one engine going, and there is a video up on YouTube which you can have a look at. And obviously a rookie driver, he doesn't know that he's stuck on the centers, but it's being used now. Pagatan Mill, where you saw a picture of one of those Littermolas, the 010Os, sometimes called after Mr. Littermola. Yeah, they actually converted these engines to fireless operations some years ago, and they do see a bit of service as fireless locos. There are stories around the Olian Mill, which was the one where that 010O was operating. It may again operate some steam. I mean, there are wild stories around, and I think we just got to keep watching YouTube. And the very nice thing, the very gratifying thing is with these videos Rob and I have been putting up, that we're getting so much interest from native Indonesians who, you know, seemed not to be interested in this a few years ago, and now they are. And it's quite wonderful. And I can be fairly sure that if anything like this happens, a return to steam happens there, if anywhere, we'll know pretty quickly on YouTube. So just keep the YouTube searches going, I think is the answer I can best give you.
Yeah. Oh, that's been very interesting, Ross, and thank you everyone for your comments. And no, it was quite a fascinating presentation, and that plethora of different sorts of drive mechanisms on locomotives. They're truly amazing.
Stunning. It's my pleasure. I just love, I could do it all night. So.
And of course,
thanks for having me.
In the UK at the moment, there's a Luttmeiler locomotive that's being restored.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's no reason these things couldn't be got out. I don't know, that very first shot at Praja factory, they were phenomenal looking engines, and the reason they had them was they were the one factory that really operated in quite hilly country, and you would have needed big things like that to haul a sizable cane train.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. But is there any more questions?
Just a bit on bagasse.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to trade off the amount of bagasse you need for running the mill itself with what's available for the locos. And in Queensland, they were burning the bagasse quite successfully to power the mills by using effectively fluidized bed combustion.
Yep.
It all burns in midair.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think that was exactly what Mr. Porter was talking about too, with his with the work he was doing in Cuba. That was exactly the sort of system he had, and they weren't just engines that were designed probably to burn coal, suddenly given bagasse to burn instead. I think that would be the story. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also for Nigel, you may have seen my comment earlier. It was Ollie and I think they were burning coconut husks. That was even lower calorific value than bagasse.
If they, yeah, they could get into things like that if they got into a real bind. Olean used to be an oil burning mill, you know, and it was fantastic because it was very flat and you could just stand there and you'd see these plumes of smoke go up and you'd say, ha ha, there's one coming from there, there's one coming from there, you know. It wasn't quite so easy in other places, but that was a good one.
Yeah. All right.
I've got another question, but it's getting away from the fuel for a minute.
Yeah.
It was totally obvious to me that the operation of their crew, they had either two people or one person sitting on the footplate. That was common practice, was it, with all the mills? And was there many people that got killed or accidents or people falling off that you knew of?
I don't know. I imagine they hung on like grim death, some of them, and I've seen some of them actually doing, some of those sandmen doing their jobs by standing backwards, hanging onto the smoke box clasp with one hand and throwing the stuff on with another one. Actually, Rob and I have got another one we will be putting up on his site, but the guy actually comes running along behind the locomotive, which is going bunker first, by the way. Now, it's hilarious, but yeah. Look, I don't know. I'm sure someone got skittled by it, yeah, but I would imagine they learned the tricks of the trade fairly quickly, yeah. I never saw them.
Just saying the speeds were very low.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yes,
and he wanted the train to stop, just close the regulator, and within inches it was stopped.
Yeah.
I didn't see any. I didn't see any harnesses or anything like that, or ropes or anything like that on.
No. I mean, if you looked at Frank's South Africa pictures last year, they were much kinder. They had the same sort of thing of people standing there holding, you know, throwing sand on the track. But you would notice in that they had proper little, you know, areas there for them to stand. They had proper little sort of fenced off things, you know, rather like a conductor stands to conduct an orchestra, something like that, so it doesn't fall off. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. No, fascinating stuff. Thank you, everyone. It's approaching 10 o'clock here in Australian Eastern Standard Time. And thank you all.
1 o'clock here in the UK.
Yeah. Well, I'll stay in the UK. And we'll have a good sleep here in Australia.
We certainly will.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Thank you for that we could you invite us, and again in Germany and Europe. It was a great fun.
No, it's a pleasure.
Yep, I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mike, I'll hand it over to you to close the show down.
Okay, just before we do close down, Bill, just want to remind everyone that next meeting in 2 months' time, we remain in Indonesia. Frank Stanford will be giving a presentation on one of his visits there, or might have been a couple, I'm not sure, Frank. But so we're keeping the theme going a little bit, so it should be quite interesting.
All right.
Otherwise, we'll just close down. Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
All the best.
Bye. Good night from Brisbane.
Good night from Brisbane.
All right.